We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings from Tbilisi, Georgia, the other side of somebody's world, certainly the world I used to live in back on the west coast of America. This is the Anadromist, Byrne power. Remember, Anadromous is a word that means going against the stream like salmon do, swimming upriver. And that's what we're trying to do today, is kind of swim upriver to see how we got to where we are. We've been following a historical course of events starting. We decided to start at World War II, since that was a big enough earth-shattering event, to see how we got to where we are in the current moment, with its confusions and propaganda, its over-reliance on technology, people kind of caught in a web of entertainment and screens, unsure of what is reality or what is the self. And these are very current states of affair. These did not exist, certainly not when we began this historical survey in 1945, we'll say, at the end of World War II. So, let's see. Let me summarize how we got here. Summarize what we've done so far. World War II. According to John Keegan, the biggest event in history. One could put the Black Plague, but the Black Plague didn't destroy buildings, didn't invent atomic bombs, didn't show the human capacity for evil in the same way the Holocaust did. And World War II was an event in the middle of the 20th century of a whole range of connected events, starting with World War I, going to the Russian Revolution, the Great Depression, World War II, of course, and then the Cold War and all of its sideshow wars. And all of those together killed far over 100 million people. In fact, communism alone did that. So it's probably closer to 150 million. I haven't actually checked on the statistics recently, but it's a whole lot of people. And that created psychic damage. That is to say, not only did it destroy things, not only did Europe and parts of Asia have to reconstruct themselves, but we also had to live with the world that we had created. A world of fear and suspicion, a world where people just wanted to get away from the insanity of war, which of course led to more wars, which led us to the 1950s. In Europe, that was a time of kind of despair, leading to things like existentialism. Yet at the same time, the economy starts to slowly grow again. The 1950s in America was something very different. America, while losing thousands of soldiers, came out pretty much on top of the world. Our financial resources were absolutely staggering. The dollar was almighty. And what Americans did was, well, the soldiers came home. If they were young enough, they went to college. They sent their children eventually to college. They moved into new suburbs, and they moved into, they drove on superhighways that were being created in the 1950s. They bought television sets and watched things on television. They were, essentially life was good. A veteran from World War II probably came home, tried to put out of his mind what happened, and raised his family while suffering from, well, shell shock. post-traumatic stress disorder. I like George Carlin's take on the difference between shell shock and post-traumatic stress disorder, and all the words we use to kind of disguise what is actually happening to people. And we use weaker and weaker words to describe it, which kind of summarizes what has happened since the middle of the century towards where we are now.
I don't like words that hide the truth. I don't like words that conceal reality. I don't like euphemisms or euphemistic language. And American English is loaded with euphemisms because Americans have a lot of trouble dealing with reality. Americans have trouble facing the truth. So they invent a kind of a soft language to protect themselves from it. And it gets worse with every generation. For some reason, it just keeps getting worse. I'll give you an example of that. There's a condition in combat. Most people know about it. It's when a fighting person's nervous system has been stressed to its absolute peak and maximum, can't take any more input. The nervous system has either snapped or is about to snap. In the First World War, that condition was called shell shock. Simple, honest, direct language. 2 syllables. Shell shock. Almost sounds like the guns themselves. That was 70 years ago. Then a whole generation went by, and the Second World War came along, and the very same combat condition was called battle fatigue. 4 syllables now. Takes a little longer to say. Doesn't seem to hurt as much. Fatigue is a nicer word than shock. Shell shock. Battle fatigue. Then we had the war in Korea, 1950. Madison Avenue was riding high by that time, and the very same combat condition was called operational exhaustion. Hey, we're up to 8 syllables now. And the humanity has been squeezed completely out of the phrase. It's totally sterile now. Operational exhaustion. Sounds like something that might happen to your car. Then, of course, came the war in Vietnam, which has only been over for about 16 or 17 years. And thanks to the lies and deceit surrounding that war, I guess it's no surprise that the very same condition was called post-traumatic stress disorder. Still 8 syllables, but we've added a hyphen. And the pain is completely buried under jargon. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I'll bet you if we'd have still been calling it shell shock, some of those Vietnam veterans might have gotten the attention they needed at the time. I'll bet you that. I'll bet you that.
That is to say, all these strange words that disguise the meanings of events or change them in strange, subtle ways. We're living in this kind of fallout from language, which goes back to what happened during what we're about to talk about today. So then what happens is, so Americans are raising their families. You know, most of them will still say, yes, I believe in God, I believe in the 10 Commandments. You know, they'll go to church. There was kind of a religious revival in the 1950s. And as their children came up and asked them questions, like, why should I go to college? The answer was basically, you should go to college so you can get a good job, so you can have enough money to send your kids to college, which is kind of circular. When the children came up and said, Daddy, why shouldn't I sleep with the daughter of the man next door? And why should I wait for marriage? The answer would be, well, that's how we always do it, and it's important to be moral, and there's the 10 Commandments, and things like that. Meanwhile, the father of the family might sleep with the wife of the man next door, but it would be very secret. And so there was hypocrisy in the true sense of the word. And then there came a time when all these students went to college and started to question, how come we're just now finding out about the Holocaust? And what about the atomic bomb and what we did to Hiroshima, or Hiroshima, as it was called at the time? What about, us dropping bombs on Dresden? Were we that moral? And the parents would just kind of get upset and said, look, we fought a war against, fascism, we won. let's not dredge it up again. Meanwhile, in school, they were learning to question. They were learning to be existentialists. They were learning to, a lot of the ideas that had been brewing philosophically had been percolating down from Nietzsche to Hegel to Kant to, more contemporary philosophers like Sartre and Camus. All of these things had been percolating down to the students, who were then saying, well, why do we do the things we do? And there wasn't any good answer, especially from a generation of parents who like to relax. Look at the cover of any easy listening record from the 1950s. It's all about relaxation. You see these people with martinis, reclining on lounges, or having pillows, little stuffed dogs, things like this. While they were relaxing, their students were joining folk protest movements or listening to this new kind of thing called rock and roll, whatever that was. It's just, they'll grow out of it. So then came the 1960s, and there was a president, John Kennedy, who said, ask not what you can do for your country, ask what your country can do for you. No, it's just the opposite. That's the way it seems today. People are more like, what can my country do for me? I'm tired of trying to do things for anybody else. But it was really, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. But at the time, the younger people in particular heard that and said, I want to help. I want to help create a world without fear, without bombs, without poverty, without war. And so they joined things like the Peace Corps, and there were other initiatives at the time. And of course, they got involved with the civil rights struggle. And then Kennedy was shot. And that was another blow. Here were people, Kennedy was the generation of men who went and fought in World War II. He was the first president from that generation. And there was the idea that, look, we're going to change the world now. At least the rhetoric was there. The reality is something different, as it always is in politics. So Kennedy dies. And it leaves this wound in the American psyche, which starts to change the thinking of people. It changes the thinking of people like Bob Dylan, who decides, I'm not doing this folky protest stuff anymore. That's all just politics. I'm going to do something poetic, something surreal, something unnameable. So he writes songs like Mr. Tambourine Man or Like a Rolling Stone. He eventually goes electric to do that, which creates another scandal in the folk protest world. Then he influences people like the Beatles, who take his ideas. Yes, they change their lyrics from, I want to hold your hand to Strawberry Fields, whatever that means, which I'm sure there are people who will tell me exactly what that means, but what does that mean? And then, but the Beatles have also changed the music as well as the lyrics. So the Beatles and Dylan are like these two poles. But there was another one, and that was Jimi Hendrix, who also changes his lyrics and starts writing these extraordinarily sci-fi-oriented, science fiction-oriented songs like Purple Haze, or 1983, Merman I Will Be, these strange songs. And then, more importantly, he changes the music completely and adds these heavy sounds that hadn't been heard since like Bach's organ or the early 20th century, people like Holst or Stravinsky, these heavy chord progressions and stuff, which eventually creates things like heavy metal. Also influenced were the people in Berkeley in 1964. They start the free speech movement, and eventually it grows into what would be called the New Left. It wasn't originally it was more, everybody gets to speak freely, but eventually it became the New Left, and this led to protests against the war. This led to And then the Vietnam War was a big deal in itself. That changes as a result of Kennedy's death, who was supposedly going to take troops out of Vietnam, realizing the quagmire it was already going to become. And instead, Johnson puts more in, and that leads to everything, all the protests and the soldiers and everything else. The civil rights movement kind of goes to a high when Johnson signs the Voting Rights Act and other civil rights legislation. But then we find, it's not enough. People are starting to demand black power. They are starting to say things like, Malcolm X gets assassinated. Martin Luther King gets assassinated. We won't even get into Robert Kennedy getting assassinated. But then you have the Black Panthers, the people who can move out of the ghettos leaving the ghettos even poorer than they were at the beginning of the decade. And so the civil rights movement kind of gets strange. And then it comes along with these new left people's ideas of protest. People are making bombs. People are there's riots in ghettos. It just gets chaotic. 1968 is like an apocalyptic year. You just go back and look at all the things that happened that year. And not just in America, but around the world. 68, there were student protests everywhere. And those protests were fed largely by what happens in Berkeley, which was inspired, among other things, by Kennedy's death and the frustration of that. So then in the mid-60s, in a place called San Francisco, already there'd been a blooming sexual revolution inspired by things like Playboy magazine, and especially with the accelerant of the pill, which suddenly allowed women to free themselves from their menstrual cycle, or at least the risk of pregnancy or something. We're still debating that today. And suddenly it was like the 60s were on. And in San Francisco, another aspect of the 60s suddenly, mushroomed. Indeed. The LSD became the currency of the land, and LSD changes your perspective. And so what happens is suddenly there's these people kind of getting pickled in the acid who are just like suddenly going over and over into some sort of state where they start acting like children. And they all start talking about love. Interestingly enough, their definition of love is coming from someone like Jack Kerouac, whose idea of love is extraordinarily, shall we say, promiscuous.
There's no reason to criticize anybody, actually.
We're
all going to go to heaven.
We are?
All of us.
Me too?
Everything, even the microphone.
I like that.
You too.
Okay.
And your cigar.
I couldn't do without it. Jack, if you think it's safe worshiping Buddha, you think you boys are out of the reach of our law enforcers by worshiping Buddha?
I don't only worship Buddha.
Whom else?
I worship Christ, I worship Allah, I worship Yahweh, who is the Father.
Uh-huh.
I worship them all.
Where did you get this worship instinct? Because I read your book.
Well, I was born.
I think it's real. I think you really worship.
In a religious home.
Are you boys afraid of the next war? Worried about it? Do you look forward?
I don't think there'll be one.
Why not?
Because things are in good hands.
You think if there were enough beats who would do a spiritual sit-down strike, civilization could be spared another war because nobody would attend?
That's too hysterical.
You don't believe in asserting yourself?
History will work its way out. Everybody will come together. The whole world will come together, East and West.
Well, by this time, the hippies were unlocking all of these things. The sexual ethics. I mean, what seemed kind of like quaint today, the Playboy philosophy, James Bond, which was part of the sexual revolution in the 60s. And by the end of the 60s, there were no clothes, as has been said. The hippies just basically did away with the whole idea of any sort of courtship or seduction or romance. And essentially just live like children who had large sexual organs and wanted to use them and were pickled in the punch. But that was just a dream. It didn't last. By 1969 already, it was clear life in San Francisco was becoming a nightmare. Thousands upon thousands of people continued coming into San Francisco well into the early 70s, looking for whatever was happening there. It was over by 1967. By the end, the summer of love was no summer of love. It was a summer of way too many people taxing all the systems of San Francisco. By the end, I think it was October, there was the original hippies kind of had, or a group of original hippies kind of had a funeral celebration called the Death of Hippie. And they carried a coffin through just to say, basically, this dream is over. But of course, people kept coming, people kept thinking the dream was on. And eventually it led to things like the Altamont Rock Festival. It led to more cults. Jonestown was in San Francisco. The Children of God came through San Francisco. The Hare Krishnas were in San Francisco. A good section of the Jesus movement started in San Francisco. Many religious movements were in San Francisco. I think at one point there was something like 60 different religious groups, new religious groups that had started in the San Francisco area. We had Manson, who went through San Francisco scooping up cult followers that he eventually moved down near Los Angeles. Anton LaVey and the Church of Satan was in San Francisco, and he put out his Satanic Bible in 1969, which was not really about people worshiping Satan. It was more, his idea was more that the philosophical underpinnings of society were total selfishness. He was following other philosophers, but reducing them. I mean, essentially it was a sub-Nietzschean philosophy, shall we call it. It wasn't really Nietzsche, but it was sub-Nietzschean. In Germany in the World War II, the Nazis had a sub-Nietzschean philosophy. It wasn't really Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a lot more subtle, but it was taking certain elements that were easy to grip. Basically living for the self, living for just yourself. And so the Satanic Church believed in living exclusively for the self. And they codified it by calling Satan essentially an archetype of the self. But they did have rituals. They were religious. It was a religious movement, among other things. So the doors were open, and then things fell apart. People started dying of drug overdoses. Already when people came to California, there were people who died of drug overdoses. There were lots more abortions from people having all that sex. Did you think you were really going to avoid that completely? No. There was just a breakdown of everything that had been traditionally part of Western civilization. So it seemed. I wouldn't say the breakdown happened yet, but it was an earthquake. Everything shifted. Everything shifted away from what had been traditional into this new world. Now, I would say that it wasn't done yet, the break. This was just if we looked at it as an ice shelf off the Antarctic, this was the snap of the ice shelf. It hadn't started drifting that far yet. It seems like it, but it was only a group of people who were drifting. But their philosophy collapsed as people like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Brian Jones, and many other rock musicians would die of drugs. It was clear that this sex, drugs, and rock and roll philosophy really didn't cut it as a serious, meaningful philosophy. Later, that philosophy would be just basically shortened to, as long as everybody's having fun, right? And that was the reason, fun became a reason to live. Not just a little thing you did, on your way to the carnival with cotton candy. But fun became the reason we do everything. And that's a problem. But at that time, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Fun, right? And it was already creating a lot of problems. So that's where I left it last time. And I'm recapping, and I've added a few things just to let anyone who's just listening to this for the first time know. If you want more details, go back to those earlier discussions. Now, where are we? What changed in the 1960s? I would say it goes down to 3 areas: morals, manners, and meaning. It's just convenient. They all happen to start with an M. Morals. Well, that's obvious. The sex was not the sex of the past. And ever since then, sex has always been problematic, but it became way problematic after that. And ever since then, the sexual ethics in first America, then the Western world, then eventually everywhere, was affected by the changes of the 1960s, from the sexual revolution to the hippies and beyond. Drugs, that's a big change in morals as well. Yes, people always had alcohol, and of course coffee is a kind of a lightweight drug. And there are other lightweight drugs. And then there's, of course, the drugs that you get at the pharmacy, some of which don't do anything at all. Some of which do quite a bit, as we've discovered, way too much. But drugs became a real permanent fixture of not only the American scene, but the global scene as a result of the 1960s. Like I said, there was an Arctic ice shelf that broke, and it started to drift away from the mainland of the history of, say, Western Europe and America. And at first that drift, it seemed chaotic. 1970s seems way more chaotic than the 1960s in many ways. The 1970s is the result of the 1960s. And what started to be immediately affected were these moral issues. But more importantly, and I think less obviously understood, are the manners. And what do I mean by manners? It's the code of ethical behavior. It's the code of aesthetic behavior. It's a code of etiquette. All of those things almost died on the spot somehow. Yeah, they persist in different ways. Different forms of ethical and etiquette and aesthetic behavior continue in different ways. But essentially, they were shot down cold by the hippies. And that changed everything. Prior to the 1960s, people cared what side of the table the fork was on. When I was young, I was told it was very important how you arranged your food on the table. Now, I did not come from a wealthy home whatsoever. I came from a poor home, single mother of immigrant parents. But it was very important to try to live like my mother used to say, well, this is what Emily Post says in her book. I don't know if my mother actually read the book. I eventually picked up that book because it was so interesting. If you go through these books, the books of etiquette by, I think it was Vanderbilt also had a book on etiquette. But if you go through these books, particularly Emily Post's book on etiquette, it's not just, we often look at etiquette as like, oh, those fussy rules that people used to make people live by. No, it wasn't those fussy rules. It was, as it was stated, a way to think of others before yourself. So the reason for putting the forks and knives in a certain place is so that there wouldn't be simple confusion at the dinner table. It wasn't every person for themselves. And yeah, maybe it was too much. I mean, I certainly don't follow those rules myself today, and you probably don't either. Although you probably have some modified version of them when you set your table. But whatever happened to those rules? They died in the 1960s. Same with clothing. If you were to walk into a church service in the 1960s, everybody would be made up for church. And this continued in many churches through the 70s. But if you go to your average church today in America, but all over the world in many places, People just come dressed. I mean, I've seen people in just T-shirts that have slogans from some rock band going to a church, as if it doesn't matter whatsoever how you dress. I've seen people in shorts, it's just like they just got off of their beach party, they go into the church. It doesn't matter. There are, some very slight remnants of this world, but essentially you can see that, for instance, now imagine this. Imagine meeting a farmer in the 1930s or 40s. He's out in his field on a hot summer day. He's on his new tractor. How is he dressed? Now imagine a farmer dressed today. What do they dress like? Probably T-shirts and short cutoffs, whatever. T-shirts and shorts. And the T-shirt probably says, the name of something that this person likes. At that time, it would have been maybe jeans and overalls, but also a white shirt, maybe a tie. That's how people dressed in the 1940s. And we might say, oh, well, those people were stupid. Why? It's because we value casualness. We value convenience and comfort over anything resembling style. Much of what passes for style today is just mixed up versions of convenience and comfort, and silliness. The amount of clothes we wear that are just purely silly, kitschy, is just absolutely amazing. If you're old enough, you might be able to think of some of the other aspects of manners that changed so much in the 1960s. Again, we live in a world. Now, one thing was how we talk to each other, but I'm going to save that along with crime although crime really gets bad in the 1970s, so maybe I should talk about it. One of the things that the 60s did was, and this goes back to the morals part, was they liberated, quote unquote, how people talk to each other. You're supposed to say how you felt. And you were constantly being told, do what you feel is right. Do what you feel. Don't hold it in. Well, manners says to hold it in. Manners says don't say things that hurt people or offend people. But this idea of just doing what you feel says to let it out. So you yell at people. You call them names you'd never have called them before. If someone bumps you on the street, you tell them to go, essentially, screw themselves. You basically are in a position where you are the arbiter of what you feel you should do. There's no one who should tell you what you think you should do. Which, of course, is absolutely ridiculous. You're always being told what to do, especially through all the messages we send to each other through all aspects of the media, from music and movies all the way down to social media. People are always telling you what to do. And you believe you are the arbiter of what that you should do. You are not. And that's one of the first steps on the road to finding some way of rediscovering some sort of meaning. But that combined with drugs, that ability to just tell someone to go basically screw themselves, is mingled with drugs and a different sexual ethic, means essentially you just do what you want. And also you get desperate. So crime began to really shoot up in the 1970s. And it shot up, one of the big reasons it shot up is because of drugs. Another reason is because people, you can find images on YouTube, for instance, of a woman driving through a McDonald's drive-through window, who then gets into a fight with the cashier over some really petty thing. She starts screaming. She comes out of the car. She attacks the person in the window. This sort of behavior, this like off-the-hook behavior, is a direct result of the essentially complete breakdown of manners and morals that came from the 1960s. I'm not trying to say that the manners and morals prior to the 1960s were in some sort of perfect condition. Oh no. And there were a lot of other problems. There are problems when everyone feels held down, when everything feels like it's suffocating you. But what we did was we then took the lid off the pot, and suddenly what was boiling underneath exploded.
We need to call the police. This is out of control. Holy shit!
And there was no good reason to essentially put the lid back on, or could anyone find the lid if there? And how would you put it back on? And the pot's been boiling ever since in different ways. So, morals changed, manners changed, and meaning changed. Well, meaning got lost is what happened. See, you can look back at the 1940s or 50s or 30s or 20s, or go back into the Middle Ages if you want, and see all the codes that held people down. Well, you can look at it as holding them down, but they held them down from drifting away too. People said, why do we do what we do? In Western society, it was, why do we do what we do? We're Christians. We believe in God. And even people who didn't believe in God or had troubled relationships with God. If you look at Edgar Allan Poe, who obviously had a troubled relationship with the divine, is constantly referring to God in his remarks, even if to say he is in some sense condemned. So that, sin and salvation was all part of the equation. It's the same with the blues or country music. You can hear country songs that are about, someone having a loving family and home, and they're afraid of losing these things. They believe in God, like Elvis Presley talked about. And then, on the other side of the coin, you have country songs and blues where suddenly it's like, I don't know, I've lost my soul. I'm a rambling man. I'm a hoochie coochie man. But it's all still in the context of this larger society. It's still in the context of sin and salvation. After World War II, these things became more superficial. And by the time of the mid-1960s, they were very superficial indeed. I would say nominal Christianity was the order of the day. And so when the hippies came along and the other people, the New Left and such, and essentially blew up the moral foundations within their own lives and the manners, it seemed very seductive. The images of dancing people in the park and people acting like children and saying like love, and this indiscriminate use of the word love became essentially, it was like honey. It was sweet. It seemed like a good, sweet, seductive thing. And people began to, people didn't stop doing drugs because the hippies got burned out. People didn't stop having sex because the hippies had problems with free love. Oh no. Everything changed. Drugs continued, like I said, to be a problem. Sexuality continued to be a massive problem, when it wasn't the same kind of problem prior to the 1960s. And one could say, well, yeah, that's because they were all doing it wrong and they were hypocrites and such. Well, now, often the word hypocrisy has changed. So what used to be hypocrisy is a person who said, I live by these standards, and acted differently. But now, it's more like this. Oh, you say there are moral standards. That's why you're a hypocrite. Because you try to live by moral standards, that's why you're a hypocrite. That's been the more recent definition of hypocrisy, and people occasionally will harken back to the older definition when they really want to make a point. But the more recent definition is, you say you have standards, look at how you're living, you are a hypocrite. There are no standards, so you should live for yourself. And that's where we are today. People believe in living for themselves, which is sad. Just sad beyond words, living for yourself. I can't find a more minuscule reason to live. And that's the point about losing meaning. Meaning went from, there is a God in the world who created human beings, and people in different cultures had different versions of their religious ideas. There was always a reason why we were here in some way, to suddenly there being no reason, or whatever reasons we had were kind of flimsy. They were all hypocritical in the new sense of the word. And so people essentially gave up. And what you find in the 1960s is lots of philosophical questions were being asked in the 1960s. But in the 1970s, was looking out for number one. Me. And that's why Tom Wolfe called it the me decade, the me generation. That's what the 70s was all about. It became about me. And one could argue it's been about me ever since. I'm the only person who matter. And I need to care about that. Now, things have changed a bit. And I would say that the current farther left philosophies have started to emphasize the collective again, but in very strange terms of what group identity you have. And yet at the same time, they're still completely infected with me. Everyone says, I define myself. Oh, really? Do you define yourself? You think you do. It isn't until you understand you don't that you can actually get some sort of true image of what yourself is. When you realize how affected by other people and the media you are, then you can start to get some glimpse of who you might be. So, meaning suffers. You can see this. The early 70s was an extraordinarily dark time. So, there were some people, like I said, still going to San Francisco. And I remember seeing these people come, but increasingly it became a lost dream. If you were in 1972 in, say, Marin County, just north of San Francisco, you might go to a freeway on-ramp and see maybe 20 or 30 people hitchhiking up north or down south. I remember watching one guy as a kid. He was sitting there, cars were going by, and he was just like, and he was kind of scruffy looking, more scruffy than me. He was kind of scruffy looking, had dark hair, kind of stringy hair, and a dark beard. Was wearing just a white T-shirt. It looked kind of grungy. And every time a person would pass, he would just like go, just blow, just completely rail on them, just completely trash them. Finally, someone stops to pick this guy up. I know because I was hitchhiking at the same place as like a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old. Finally, someone stops to pick this guy up. And when they stop and open the doors, he goes like, "It's about time." Well, that kind of gives you a little story which can serve as a metonym for the larger period. The good vibes were off. People weren't picking people up anymore. It was getting tougher and tougher. The hitchhikers would disappear from the on-ramps by about 73 or so. Why? Well, there were a lot of reasons. One was the vibes were different by 73. Another is some people were getting picked up hitchhiking and being left on the side of the road dead that's when, in the period from, say, 69 to 73 or so, there were like 5 maybe active serial killers in the San Francisco Bay Area picking people up, mostly women, and killing them? Yeah, it just didn't seem so safe anymore. If you listen to the music of the times, there was some very dark music. Particularly, it's interesting because of this, like I said, certain aspects of the civil rights movement just felt like they failed. And there were songs like Smiling Faces. Sometimes they don't tell the truth. Or Sly and the Family Stone, his album, Thank You for Talking to Me, Africa. Very dark, slow, brooding funk song. And there were a bunch of them at that time. Grail Marcus kind of gets into this period in his book Mystery Train. He's got an essay in there where he talks about the change. He's talking about Sly and the Family Stone in the essay, but it's the change in the environment. It went from these songs like Respect, which, the great Aretha Franklin song written by Otis Redding, to the title track of There's a Riot Going On from the Sly and the Family Stone album. The timing on that is 0:00. In other words, there's no riot going on. There's no change going on. There's nothing going on. And that was his uncharacteristically down beat. I mean, Sly and the Family Stone was known for being like one of the most up organizations ever as far as music goes. If you watch his performance at Woodstock, he's like the god of energy. And he's, I want to take you higher, and getting everyone to raise their hands. It's breathtaking, really. But by the early 70s, there was a sense it's failed. Or as Pete Townsend once called the 70s, the fall of the Roman Empire. There was a sense of purpose to what was going on in the 1960s. We're changing something. We're asking questions. There were so many songs about searching in the late 1960s. But that dried up by the early 1970s. You can also see this in the movies. The movies of the 1970s have to be some of the most sad, nihilistic, depressing movies to ever become box office sensations. The Godfather, 1 and 2, both huge hits, both extraordinarily dark. Let's see. The Exorcist. Jaws isn't exactly a friendly film, even though it's got a nice ending. They killed the shark. But most of the film is about the collapse of the suburban dream. Thank you, Steven Spielberg, for that. But, The Exorcist doesn't end well. And it was a huge hit. The Omen came out at that time. In fact, 1976 was the darkest period of the 1970s. And we're going to talk more about the 70s, but I just want to end here. We'll come back and talk about it next time more, because I've been talking too much the way it is. I've overlooked all the political stuff. Oh, yes. There was Nixon's paranoia. There was the Kent State massacre. 4 students shot on a college campus by the National Guard in 1970. There was, that little thing called Vietnam, droned on and on. We eventually bombed Cambodia. That helped to spark the Khmer Rouge, who then went and killed at least 1 million plus people in Cambodia. Oh yeah, then we lost that war, which did wonders for the American psyche. We certainly didn't thank any soldiers who came back from that war. And then not only did we lose, but we were chased out of there in 1975 by the Vietnamese. And it was just a national disgrace, which we've never quite recovered from. The economy started to get weird. We started to rely more on oil, but at the same time, oil prices started getting higher and higher. And then there's the economy, which was based so much on oil. America had been doing so well. Suddenly it starts to plunge because the oil prices skyrocket due to the machinations of OPEC, the oil-producing nations consortium. And there are gas lines, and people start to get violent in the gas lines, and Nixon resigns. And people might say, well, yeah, then what about feminism and gay rights? And people were choosing new ways to live. Yeah, cults continued, and what was happening with gay rights and what was happening with the feminist movement? Was that a sign that we were moving towards the perfect society? Well, it depends on your perspective what the perfect society is. Yeah, we needed women to get equal pay, and I think we largely resolved those issues, but at the same time it wasn't easy. And there were always people who wanted to push for more, as we see today. There's an endless request list of things to change and make society perfect. I think it was great that homosexuality, am I not supposed to say that anymore? That gay rights, am I supposed to say that? LGBTQ, whatever. Gay rights, that there was a tolerance now. Towards this. That was good. It was a real tolerance because people didn't really like it, but they were tolerant of it. Fine. That's how people talked at the end of the 1970s. It was kind of like, well, I don't agree with that myself, but, they can live however they want. That's tolerance. Today is, what? You don't agree with that? What? Oh, you hate them? That's tolerance today. It's like, you better change your thinking, which is not tolerance. That's something else. But that's the world we're in today. Whereas back then, people were fighting for these things, and I think some of these things really needed to be fought for. We needed to make changes. I'm not completely against the sexual revolution. Some changes needed to be made, because I once visited a family. This was in the late 1980s. They were staying in a YMCA hotel, old couple. They were both in their late 70s, early 80s at the time. And I went and visited them. They were staying in a single room, and they had a bathroom, standard bathroom. I went in there and said, can I use it? And they said, sure. I go in, close the door behind me, as usual. I come out, and they're not in the apartment anymore. And I said, where'd you go? They were standing outside in the hallway so that I would have more privacy, and they wouldn't have to listen to whatever sounds were going to come. That's like some real old school manners. And that's the kind of thing, kind of glad we got rid of those. But nevertheless, so things changed, but then they just changed way too much. All of a sudden, everything, and we lost the meaning of what we were doing. And today, as we try to find new avenues of meaning, well, there aren't any new avenues of meaning. That's the whole point. There aren't any new avenues of meaning, just like there are no new colors. The colors are going to stay the same. What provides meaning, essentially, is going to stay the same. There has to be a sense that the world itself is inherently meaningful. And if we follow the postmodern narrative of the day, and there are no meta-narratives, then that pretty much scotches the meaning part as well. If there's no meta-narratives, there's no meaning. Therefore, or the meaning is self-generated. What the hell does that mean? Really? I generate my own meaning? So that means I also have no identity except what I define myself. Everything becomes back to me, which I certainly don't believe. Anyway, that's too much. So, 1976. We had films like Network, which just showed you how much you were being manipulated by the media. And the answer is a whole lot. It was also the year Carrie came out. Very dark version, darkly humorous at that, Brian De Palma film based on a Stephen King novel of a girl who has problems at school. She has problems with changing from a child into a woman. She is bullied and teased, and then she explodes and takes everyone down with her. The end. Do you see any hope in that story? I didn't. Then there's things like, Taxi Driver. Now, Taxi Driver may be among the more despairing works of the 1970s. Robert De Niro is like a returning Vietnam vet who's drifting around aimlessly in a taxi driver. His life has no meaning. He's trying to give it meaning. He looks for things to give it meaning. At first he thinks he will save this one girl he's kind of fallen in love with, but he himself has lost so much meaning that he thinks taking the girl to a porno film would be a nice idea for a date. So he decides to kill the man she's working for, a politician, thinking that will give his life meaning. And then there's another girl, who's a very young girl, played by Jodie Foster, who is Iris. Travis Bickle, the De Niro character, decides he's going to save her from her pimp. He ends up shooting all these guys, kind of mafiosi, at the end, who are running this rather sordid New York-style 1970s brothel at the time. And in the end, they accidentally think he's a hero, because he doesn't go through and shoot the politician. And where's the meaning there? Essentially, we arrive at this point where there are many, many films in the 1970s that get to the realization that if meaning is all just generated by the self, there is no sense of meaning. Or then there's the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which essentially takes a chainsaw to the hippie philosophy and says, you know, this whole love and peace thing, it kind of went too far and it's full of bullshit. And that's where we'll leave it today. We'll leave it with that little cuddly note. And we're going to talk about this new idea, which is going to come forth in places like punk rock and rap music next. We'll also talk a little bit about disco, and we'll talk about some of the late 70s phenomena. But, yeah, let's talk about those things next time. Otherwise, I'll just go keep talking and talking, and I'm getting tired. And you're probably getting tired of listening to me, aren't you? Well, thank you for listening. I mean, if you listened to me this far, I really appreciate it. And I am living out here in a zone where I don't know what's happening. I am trying to figure out how to get my things here. I'm trying to figure out what it takes to stay here in Georgia, not the state, Tbilisi, Georgia. So if you feel like contributing to help, believe me, any little contribution will go a long way in the economy I'm in here and would be really needed. And so I do have a PayPal account down below there somewhere. Check out the link and, use it. I've also got my Anadromous Life essay site. I've written a lot about these things in different ways and many other things there. I've also got my work with Gravity from Above, looking at puppetry as a way to restore tactility and texture and to our flat-screened existences, among other things, and deal with a lot of other cultural phenomena as well at that essay site. And there's another Anadromous Life kind of document site, the Anadromous Life. And check that out. I've got videos there that are more like documents. And I am going to be putting more lectures on here when I get them edited, and they will not have video accompaniment most of the time. So, but they will be maybe something worth listening to. So keep an eye open for that. Thanks for listening. And if you want to get in touch, respond in the comments below. Go to my Facebook, the Anadromous Life page. And this is Byrne, the Anadromist, saying thanks for listening and keep swimming against the stream. That's the Anadromous Life.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.